Last night, I watched Melissa slip out the door, heels clicking against the floor like she had somewhere urgent to be. At 9 at night on a Wednesday. She was wearing perfume, the one she only wore on special occasions, which, as far as I knew, did not include a quick coffee with an old friend from work. I didn't ask questions. I knew I wouldn't get a real answer anyway. Instead, I watched the door close and waited. There was no way I'd just sit around this time. Took me an hour to decide. I could either play the fool, ignore the tension that had been building up in my gut, or do something about it. So I grabbed my keys and got in the car. I started driving, no clear direction but plenty of instinct. Melissa's usual excuses were paper thin, and I'd been sitting on suspicions for weeks. But tonight something felt different, sharp, undeniable. I thought I'd check our usual spots, those she claimed to love. The little cafe we'd gone to on our anniversary. The wine bar downtown where she once made a scene declaring how much she loved me to anyone within earshot. Sure enough, at the cafe, I saw her. She was sitting at a small table by the window, and she wasn't alone. My hands were shaking, knuckles white against the steering wheel. From where I was parked, I could see her laughing, leaning forward, hair falling over her shoulder the way it used to with me. And the guy? He looked like someone out of an ad. Slick, sharp, cocky smile. Just watching the two of them, I knew this was no innocent catch-up. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. This wasn't just about catching her. I had to be smart. Watching from my car, I felt every second drag out, turning to minutes, then nearly an hour. The longer I sat there, the more disgusted I got. Watching her touch his arm, hearing faint echoes of her laughter through the car window. She looked like a stranger, not the woman I'd known for over a decade. Then it hit me. I remembered the small gift I'd stashed in my glove box earlier, a sort of parting gift I'd planned to leave her as a surprise. This was perfect. I grabbed it, checked my reflection in the mirror, and walked inside the cafe without hesitation. The cafe was quiet, that late evening lull when only a handful of people lingered over their drinks. I walked in slowly, pretending to scan the room as if looking for someone myself, when in reality I knew exactly where I was going. Melissa's laugh echoed across the room as I approached their table, a sound that once filled me with joy and now just made my skin crawl. She was so wrapped up in this stranger that she didn't notice me until I was nearly right in front of her. I watched the smile freeze on her face as she saw me, her hand still on his arm, the warmth in her eyes evaporating into cold, startled shock. The man, let's call him Mr. Slick, shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting any sort of guest appearance in his little evening rendezvous. "Oh, hey, what are you doing here?" she stammered, pulling her hand back as if I hadn't already seen it resting on his arm. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small, neatly wrapped box I'd brought. Without taking my eyes off her, I set it down on the table right between her and her friend. "Here you go," I said, voice calm, almost too calm. "A little something I thought you'd like." Melissa looked down at the box, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for it. The guy glanced between us, clearly confused, and then fixed his eyes on me with an expression that showed he thought he was the one in control here. He didn't realize yet that he was in the middle of something bigger than he could handle. "What's this?" she whispered, her face turning pale as she looked at me. She knew me well enough to recognize when something was about to explode. "Go on, open it," I replied, barely containing a smirk. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside was a flash drive, one I'd spent days meticulously loading up with every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Text messages, emails, photos, locations. Her whole second life there in that tiny device. Everything she thought she'd hidden so well from me. Melissa's face dropped the moment she saw what was in that box. Her eyes darted to me, then back down to the flash drive, and then to Mr. Slick, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. It was like a silent alarm went off in her head, her expression shifting from shock to something closer to fear. What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just a little highlight reel of your recent activities," I said, keeping my tone low, almost casual. "Go ahead. Show him. Or should I?" I could see her mind scrambling, gears turning as she tried to process how this was happening. She shot Mr. Slick a nervous smile, like she could still salvage this somehow, as if this was all just some kind of misunderstanding. Jason, please, can we talk about this later? In private. She gave me a pleading look, like she thought she could just sweep this under the rug. But I wasn't having it. Later? You've been saying that for months, Melissa. I kept my voice calm, but the edge in it was sharp enough to make her flinch. And private? You know what? That's funny coming from you. Mr. Slick, finally catching the tone of the situation, muttered something about needing to get going, and started to push his chair back. But I placed a firm hand on his shoulder, holding him in place. Not so fast, man. You're part of this now. He looked at Melissa, probably hoping she'd jump in and save him. She didn't. She just sat there, stunned, caught between embarrassment and a desperation to keep up her facade. I didn't know she was married, he stammered, raising his hands as if that might somehow dissolve his guilt. She told me you two were separated. I raised an eyebrow, more amused than angry. Of course she did. That's her favorite line. Works like a charm, doesn't it, Melissa? She looked away, lips pressed into a thin line, but I didn't give her a chance to answer. I mean, it's a good story. Only thing is, it's not true. See, Melissa's been keeping her separation a secret from everyone but herself. The cafe was dead silent, the handful of people there all trying not to look over but failing miserably. The tension was thick enough to cut, and I could feel Melissa practically vibrating with anger and shame. Melissa's eyes darted around, searching the room for any possible escape. But there wasn't one. She was cornered, and she knew it. Jason, please, she started, lowering her voice, probably hoping to salvage some shred of control. This isn't what you think. You're blowing it way out of proportion. Couldn't help but laugh at that. Really? This isn't what I think? You sitting here with him? I jabbed a finger toward Mr. Slick, who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Sharing drinks, holding hands and lying about us? Because it looks pretty much exactly like what I think. I leaned in closer, my voice steady but icy. Do you want me to tell him the rest? Or do you want to do the honors? Her face turned pale. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. She glanced at Mr. Slick, who was looking increasingly horrified as he began to piece together just how deep this went. I don't know what you're talking about, she muttered, crossing her arms defensively, trying to put up some last line of defense. Oh, don't play dumb now, Melissa. You've been pretty smart about this whole thing until now, haven't you? I said, feeling a sharp satisfaction as the color drained from her face even more. Like those business trips you've been taking, or how you've been siphoning off money from our joint account. You thought I wouldn't notice. She turned back to Mr. Slick, her voice shaking. It's not like that. He's twisting things around. He looked at her, eyebrows drawn together, his confidence visibly shaken. Melissa, what's he talking about? You said you were separated and just living together for the kids. The look on her face then. It was a mixture of desperation and trapped fury. She reached for his hand, as if that last connection might keep him on her side. I was going to tell you. It's complicated, okay? Jason's. He's trying to make this sound worse than it is. Oh, believe me, I interrupted. I don't need to make anything sound worse. You've done a fine job of that yourself. Melissa's hands were trembling now, her usual confidence crumbling with every word I said. She tried to regain her composure, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for the right excuse, the right lie. But she was cornered, and she knew it. Jason, she hissed, voice barely above a whisper. Let's just go outside and talk about this. You're making a scene. Oh, now you care about privacy? I shot back, unable to keep the edge of anger out of my voice. You didn't mind sneaking around behind my back. But now that people are watching, now it's a problem? She flinched, her cheeks going red. Mr. Slick shifted uncomfortably beside her, his gaze darting between us, probably wondering what kind of mess he'd gotten himself into. Look, man, I had no idea. He started, but I cut him off. Save it. This isn't about you. You're just the latest in her series of little adventures, I said, letting the word hang in the air between us. Or did she tell you she was on business during those weekends she was with you? He blinked, taken aback, and then looked over at Melissa. Wait, weekends? You told me you were only going out after work. Melissa's face twisted in panic, and she tried to grab his hand again, like she was trying to physically keep him on her side. It's not what you think, okay? He's just... Jason's upset, and he's trying to twist this into something it's not. But Mr. Slick pulled his hand back, finally realizing he wasn't in control of this situation. He looked at her, betrayal dawning on his face. So, wait, this whole time you weren't separated? You were lying to me, too. I let out a low laugh, not bothering to hide my satisfaction.
Surprise.
Melissa here is a master of stories. She's been weaving them for years, telling me one thing, telling you another. I leaned in, keeping my gaze locked on her. The only difference now is that both of us know the truth. Melissa stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She looked at me with a mix of rage and desperation, and for a second, I thought she might lash out. Melissa stood there, visibly shaking, her eyes burning into mine with a fury I hadn't seen before. For a moment, it was like we were the only two people in that cafe, locked in some kind of silent, vicious standoff. I could see her scrambling, trying to find an angle to turn this around, to regain even an ounce of control. Fine, she spat, crossing her arms. So what? You came here just to humiliate me in public? Is that it? You think this makes you the hero? Her tone was pure venom, but it just bounced off me. I could see right through her anger. It was her last defense, a way to make me out to be the bad guy, to shift the blame back onto me. But I wasn't letting her do that. Not now. Hero? I said, letting out a bitter laugh. No, Melissa. There are no heroes here. But if you think for 1 second I'm just going to stand by while you string me, and him, along with your lies, then you really don't know me at all. Mr. Slick looked at her, a mix of shock and disgust on his face. He seemed like he wanted to say something but was at a loss for words, watching this whole nightmare unfold and realizing he'd been caught in the middle of it. She turned to him, eyes wide and desperate, trying to salvage the situation. Look, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Okay? I thought I could work it out. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Didn't want to hurt anyone? I repeated, my voice rising despite my attempt to keep calm. You hurt everyone. Me, him, our family. And for what? Just to keep playing both sides and pretending you're some poor victim in all this. Melissa's face contorted, and I could tell my words had hit hard. But she wasn't backing down. Don't you dare put this all on me, she hissed. You think you're innocent in this? You think I didn't notice how checked out you've been for months? All those late nights you spent working? Or were those just excuses too? This was her game now, trying to pin it back on me to make me question everything, as if I was somehow the one who drove her to this. I felt my jaw clench, anger surging up like a wave. Oh, don't even try that with me, I replied, my voice low, steady, yet laced with fury. I was working late to pay for the life you pretended you wanted. For our kids, for our future. Meanwhile, you're out here playing the single woman with guys who probably don't even know I exist. She fell silent, her eyes darting around the cafe, realizing just how many people were watching now. The barista was staring openly, a couple at the corner table glancing over with wide-eyed shock. Mr. Slick shook his head, pushing his chair back and standing up, clearly done with whatever fantasy she'd sold him on. I can't believe this, he muttered, looking down at her. You're unbelievable. Melissa reached out to him, desperation in her eyes. Wait, I can explain. Just give me a second. But he pulled his arm away, stepping back from her, a look of disgust plain on his face. I watched her try to keep everything from falling apart. But it was too late. The web of lies she'd spun had finally unraveled. Right here, in front of everyone. Watching her crumble, her mask finally slipping, felt almost surreal. Melissa, the woman who could talk her way out of anything, who always knew exactly what to say to keep people where she wanted them. Now here she was, desperately scrambling to keep even a shred of her dignity intact. Mr. Slick backed away, shaking his head like he'd just woken up from a bad dream. I don't know what kind of person I thought you were, but this is messed up. He shot one last disgusted glance at her before turning and making a beeline for the door, leaving her standing there, hand outstretched, as if she could somehow pull him back. As he left, she looked over at me, her eyes flashing with anger, humiliation, And something else. A fear she'd never let me see before. It was like she knew that this time, she was truly cornered. "Are you happy now?" she hissed, voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You just had to make a public spectacle of it, didn't you?" "Oh, you think I'm the one who made a scene?" I replied, my voice calm but cutting. "Melissa, this is all on you. You brought us here, all your lies, all those stories you thought I'd never find out about. I'm just finally showing the world who you really are." Her face hardened, her pride kicking in. "You're so self-righteous, Jason," she spat, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "Like you're some kind of saint. Maybe if you'd been a little more attentive, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." Ever think of that? That struck a nerve. She was still trying to blame me, still twisting things to make herself look like the victim. "You're seriously going to stand here and act like this is my fault?" I shot back, incredulous. "I gave everything to you, to our family, while you were out with every guy who'd give you the time of day. And somehow I'm the bad guy." She looked away, her jaw tight, refusing to meet my gaze. I could tell she didn't have a real defense, but she wasn't about to admit it. Not here. Not to me. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I'd carried these last few months lift. Just a little. "You know what, Melissa?" I said, finally breaking the silence. "I don't even care about what you have to say anymore. Not your excuses, not your blame, none of it. I'm done." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something like regret crossing her face. But it was too late for that. The Melissa I once knew was gone, and in her place was a stranger. One I wanted nothing to do with. For a split second, something in her expression shifted. Regret, maybe, a glimmer of panic, as if she'd finally realized the depth of what she'd destroyed. But just as quickly as it appeared, that vulnerability vanished, replaced by her familiar cold, unyielding mask. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms defiantly. "If you're so done, then go. Walk away, Jason. See if I care." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. She really thought she could still control the narrative, make herself look like the one being wronged. She was digging in her heels, determined to save face, no matter the cost. I watched her carefully, wondering if this was the same woman I had loved for so many years, or if I'd just been blind to who she truly was. "I'm walking away," I said, voice steady but filled with finality. "But not before I make one thing clear." I leaned in close enough that she could hear me, my words low but sharp. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will. You can act tough, pretend you don't care, but trust me, this life you've been juggling, it's over. And that includes everything you think you're going to walk away with." Her eyes narrowed, confusion mixing with her fury. "What the hell does that mean?" I didn't answer. Instead, I straightened up, letting her sit with the fear of what that might mean. The truth was, I'd already started the process weeks ago, moving money out of our joint accounts, transferring assets, making sure that when this all came crashing down, she wouldn't be left standing on solid ground. I hadn't planned on using any of it. I thought maybe I'd never need to. But seeing her now, watching her try to turn this mess into her victory, I realized I'd made the right choice. "You've spent so long lying to everyone around you, manipulating, playing the victim," I continued, shaking my head. "But you're about to find out that actions have consequences. And for once, you won't be able to talk your way out of this." A flicker of panic crossed her face. I saw her calculating, trying to piece together how much I knew, how much I might have already done. "You're bluffing," she scoffed. But I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "You wouldn't just leave me with nothing. We have a family, Jason. Didn't stop you from throwing it all away, did it?" I replied, stepping back. "This is your mess, Melissa. Clean it up however you like. But don't expect me to be around when you do." With that, I turned and walked away, not looking back, leaving her standing alone in that cafe. No more excuses, no more lies to shield her. Just her and the reality she'd built as I walked out. My mind was a storm of emotions. Anger, disgust, even a strange sense of relief. But as I stepped into the cool night air, something else hit me. A deep sadness, one that had been buried beneath all the anger. This was the woman I'd built a life with, trusted, poured everything into. And now she was just someone I used to know. I sat in my car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, letting it all sink in. I knew there was no going back, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I thought of our kids, how they'd ask questions I'd have to answer carefully, trying not to let them see just how much it hurt. They didn't deserve any of this. After a few minutes, I drove home in silence, replaying every detail of what had just happened, wondering if I'd done the right thing, wondering if I should have handled it differently. But I kept coming back to the same answer. There was no good way to handle something like this. No version of the story where we'd end up okay. This was the reality, and it was brutal. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. I glanced around the living room, the pictures on the walls of birthdays, holidays, all the moments we'd shared. They felt like someone else's memories now, echoes from a life that belonged to a different person. I headed to our bedroom and opened the closet, pulling out a bag I'd packed a week ago when I'd first considered that it might come to this. Inside were my essentials, clothes, documents, everything I'd need to be out of the house for a while. The decision had felt surreal at the time, like something out of a bad dream. But tonight, I knew I was ready to leave. Before I left the room, I pulled out my phone, opened our group family chat, and took one last look at the texts and pictures we'd shared as a family. I felt a pang of guilt and sadness, knowing that I was walking out of the life we'd built. But I also knew staying would mean living in a shadow, pretending things could ever be the same. I typed out a brief message to Melissa, one she'd see when she finally came home and realized I wasn't there. "I'm done, Melissa. I'll be in touch about the kids, but I won't be around to play the fool anymore. This life you've built on lies, you can have it. I'm done pretending." With that, I hit send, grabbed my bag, and walked out of our home, leaving everything behind but my dignity as I closed the door behind me. The finality of it settled in, heavy and unrelenting. I got in the car and started driving with no real destination, just needing to put as much distance as I could between myself and the memories I just left behind. I didn't have a plan, but the road stretched open before me, offering some strange sense of freedom, like a quiet promise that there was a life beyond all this. I drove aimlessly, passing through familiar streets, scenes of a life that was still warm in my mind. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me, but I ignored it. I knew it was Melissa, probably realizing by now that I was serious, that I was gone, that the spell she'd had me under was broken. I finally pulled over by the waterfront, parking in a quiet spot overlooking the dark expanse of water. I sat there, listening to the gentle waves lap against the shore, letting the silence wrap around me like a balm. The relief was subtle, but it was there, a sense that for the first time in months, I wasn't tangled in her lies or trying to second-guess her every move. I could just breathe. I picked up my phone, finally deciding to see the message she'd sent, half expecting some desperate attempt at damage control, some last-ditch plea. But when I opened it, it was worse. All she'd written was, "You're making a huge mistake."
No επάλεγη.
No acknowledgement of what she'd done. Just one last twist of the knife, one last attempt to make me doubt myself, to pull me back in and make me question everything. And in that moment, it all became crystal clear. She wasn't going to change. She would twist, manipulate, and lie until there was nothing left of me. But she wouldn't apologize. She couldn't even acknowledge the pain she'd caused. She just wanted me to come crawling back into her world of half-truths and deception. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could respond, unleash everything I'd held back, tell her exactly what I thought of her games and her lies. But I realized that any reply, any reaction, would only feed her ego. She wanted me angry, hurt, confused, anything but free. So instead, I deleted the message. In that small act, I felt a surge of power. I wasn't the Jason who'd begged for honesty or clung to the broken pieces of our marriage. I was done. For the first time, I felt the pull of something like peace, a calmness that had been missing for far too long. And as I looked out over the water, I knew I was ready to start the long process of rebuilding my life, without her lies, without anything holding me back. The silence in the car felt heavier now, but it was a cleansing kind of weight, a purging of everything toxic that had been piling up inside me. I looked out over the water, letting the cold night air clear my head, trying to map out what came next. This wasn't just about leaving her. It was about leaving behind the version of me that had let her take control of my life, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. After a few minutes, I started scrolling through my contacts, stopping at the names of people I hadn't reached out to in months. Old friends I'd fallen out of touch with, my brother, even my parents, who'd been suspiciously quiet lately whenever I mentioned Melissa. In her own quiet way, she'd managed to keep me isolated, subtly casting shadows over my closest relationships until I barely recognized the distance growing between me and everyone else. I decided to call my brother, Aaron, first. I felt a pang of anxiety as the phone rang, realizing how much I'd missed just talking to him. When he picked up, his voice came through the line, warm and surprised. "Jason? Man, it's been a while. Everything okay?" His tone was light, but I could hear the unspoken questions behind it. Aaron had always been perceptive, and I had a feeling he knew more about my situation than I'd wanted to admit. "No," I said, a shaky laugh escaping me. "Actually, nothing's okay. I left her, Aaron. I found out about, well, everything. It's over." There was a pause, and then I heard him let out a long sigh.
"I am sorry, Mom."
"Really? I wish I could say I'm surprised, but, well, I felt a strange comfort in his honesty, the validation I'd been starved for. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed it, that simple acknowledgement that this wasn't all in my head, that I hadn't just been imagining things. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think I knew for a while. I just didn't want to believe it." Aaron's voice softened. "Listen, you're better off. She made her choices, and now you can make yours. You've got people who care about you, and we've been waiting for you to come back. Take it one day at a time, okay? Don't let her mess with your head anymore." His words settled over me like a balm, soothing the wounds I hadn't let anyone see. I thanked him, feeling a little stronger, a little more grounded. We made plans to catch up in person soon, and by the time I hung up, I felt like a piece of myself had returned, one I hadn't even realized was missing. Sitting there, staring at the phone in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A glimmer of hope, a small but undeniable spark that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life that wasn't defined by her lies. As I sat there, the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. There was a strange freedom in it, like I was on the edge of something new, terrifying but exhilarating. I knew I couldn't just go back to the way things were. I had to rebuild, reshape my life entirely. For the first time in years, I'd be living on my own terms, no longer tangled up in the constant twists of her deception. The next few hours passed in a blur. I drove to a nearby motel, checked in, and sat down on the edge of a stiff, unfamiliar bed, staring at the beige walls, wondering what my next step should be. I wanted to feel something definitive, relief, maybe, or triumph, but it was mostly just emptiness. The quiet was a blessing and a curse, a mirror held up to the void I'd been avoiding. I reached for my phone, scrolling through old photos and memories, trying to sift through what had been real and what had been a lie. Images of our family vacations, the laughter we shared, even the quieter moments on lazy Sunday mornings. Had any of it meant as much to her as it had to me? Or had it all just been part of her carefully crafted story? Finally, I stopped at a picture of my kids, the two of them grinning ear to ear, arms wrapped around each other. That image grounded me. They were my why, my reason to keep going, to keep pushing through no matter how broken I felt. Whatever else fell apart, my relationship with them was something I'd protect fiercely. I'd make sure they saw their dad as someone who chose honesty and self-respect over living in a lie, no matter how comfortable it might have been. Just as I was putting my phone down, a new message came through, from Melissa. I braced myself, dreading the thought of reading her words. I knew it would be more manipulation, more blame-shifting, anything to try and pull me back. But something inside me, a twisted kind of curiosity, pushed me to open it. The message read, "You're abandoning everything we built. You're going to regret this, Jason. The kids won't understand why you walked away." My stomach twisted. She was using our children now, trying to manipulate me with the one thing I cared about most. I gritted my teeth, feeling a surge of anger, but it was different this time. Calmer, stronger. I'd seen this tactic from her before, but tonight, I was ready for it. I typed out my reply, simple and to the point. "No, Melissa. They'll understand who walked away from what mattered. They'll see who chose to protect them and who chose to destroy trust. This is on you." I hit send and set the phone aside, no longer interested in her response. For once, I felt certain, resolute. I'd spend the next days, weeks, months proving her wrong, not by fighting her, but by showing my kids that a real parent doesn't lie, doesn't betray, that a real parent stays true, even when it hurts. The next morning, the weight of my decision settled over me with a new kind of clarity. The motel room felt cold, but not in an uncomfortable way, more like a reset, a blank slate. As I packed up my things and left, a sense of purpose kicked in. I knew I had a long road ahead, but I'd made my choice, and there was no turning back. I spent the next few days preparing for what was coming. I contacted a lawyer to get ahead on the divorce process, making sure I was equipped to handle whatever Melissa might throw my way. There were financials to sort out, custody agreements to plan, and conversations with family members who, I realized, were also trying to pick up the pieces of the situation in their own way. When I called my parents, I could hear the concern in my mom's voice, the hesitation of someone trying to support me without prying too much. "We're here for you, Jason," she said, voice gentle but steady. "Just let us know how we can help, okay?" Talking to her, I felt a surge of gratitude and shame at once. I hadn't let them in, hadn't told them how much I'd been struggling. But now, the barriers I'd built to protect Melissa's reputation, to keep everything looking fine, were gone. For the first time, I could lean on people who genuinely cared, people who'd always wanted to see me happy, even if I'd been too blind to realize it. Then came the hardest part, explaining things to my kids. I met them at my parents' house, where Melissa had reluctantly agreed to drop them off. She didn't look at me as she handed over their bags, and I caught a flash of something in her eyes. Anger, maybe, or resentment. She'd lost her grip, and I could see that it unsettled her deeply. But I was done caring about what she thought. My only focus now was the two little lives she and I had brought into this mess. Once we settled in, I took them for a walk around the neighborhood. They laughed and chased each other down the sidewalk, and for a moment, I felt like things were normal. But when we sat down on a bench under a big oak tree, I knew it was time to say something real, something honest, even if it was difficult. "Listen, you guys," I began, my voice wavering a little. "Things are going to be different for a while. Mom and we're not going to be living together anymore." My daughter looked at me, her brow furrowing as she tried to understand. "Why, Dad? Are you and Mom mad at each other?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "No, sweetheart, we're not mad. Sometimes, adults have problems that they can't fix no matter how hard they try. But no matter what, both of us love you more than anything in the world. That's never going to change." They both looked at me, their faces a mix of confusion and sadness, and it tore at me. But I knew that telling them the truth, at least a version of it they could understand, was the first step toward building the kind of honest, solid relationship I wanted them to have. No secrets, no lies, just love and a promise to always be there. As I hugged them, I felt something in me begin to mend. I wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, I knew I'd keep moving forward, step by step, for them and for myself. After the talk with my kids, something shifted in me. There was a quiet resolve, a certainty that I hadn't felt in years. Melissa's manipulation, the tangled web of lies, those were in the past. Now all that mattered was moving forward, even if I had to do it piece by piece. The days turned into weeks, and I began to settle into my new life, establishing routines with my kids. We'd spend time after school, diving into homework and stories, building our own rhythms. Every small victory, every smile, every laugh felt like another piece of me coming back together. And little by little, I felt the weight of the past loosen its grip. Melissa, of course, didn't make it easy. The divorce was filled with the usual battles. She fought me on custody, finances, even on minor things like holidays. But I had my lawyer, my family, and a determination to shield my kids from the fallout. I wouldn't let her drag them into the mess she'd created, no matter how bitter things got between us. One evening, as I was tucking my son into bed, he looked up at me, his small hand gripping mine. "Dad, are you happy?" he asked, his innocent gaze searching my face. The question hit me hard. I hadn't thought about happiness in so long. I'd been focused on survival, on staying strong for them. But looking at him, I realized I was. Maybe not in the big cinematic way, but in a quiet, resilient kind of way. I was building something real, something honest, and that was worth everything. Yeah, buddy, I said, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. I'm getting there. He smiled, a little sleepy, and nestled down into his pillow, content. As I left his room, I felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth that settled over me like a blanket. This was my life now, imperfect, scarred, but my own. And as I lay down that night, I knew that, no matter how messy things had been, I was finally free. Free to live, free to heal, and free to rebuild a life where honesty and trust came first. It had taken betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, but I'd found my way through it. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized I hadn't just left Melissa behind. I'd left behind the fear, the doubt, and the need to keep pretending. In the quiet of that moment, I knew I was finally home.